I'm Don Cavallini. I'm the co-chair of the Pitt County Coalition Against Racism, one of the organizations that are part of the network almost from the very beginning. In all 16 summits that we've had, I guess I've been here for 15 out of 16. And so the Coalition Against Racism, along with RENA, Rogers Road Eubanks Neighborhood Association, which David represents, along with Black Workers for Justice, have been some of the founding members of the Environmental Justice Network here in North Carolina. Many of you know, because some of you, most of you are from North Carolina, that this year and part of last year marks sort of a watershed moment in the movement for justice. And this historical period, when the power of the ruling class is being increasingly consolidated, requires direct challenges to the institutions which are oppressing people. So the Forward Together, Not One Step Back movement, some people refer to as Moral Mondays, has been directly challenging those seats of power and the oppressors that have responsible for such devastation. So to speak to that and how the EJ relates to that movement, we have Saladin Muhammad, who, in addition to being Naeema's husband, is a retired field organizer for United Electrical Radio and Machine Workers Union, Local 150, and he is one of the co-coordinators of Southern Workers Assembly and a Moral Monday arrestee. I give you Saladin Muhammad.
Moral Monday is a very important movement. But all movements, no matter how they are important, particularly, during the period of their emergence, they have strengths and weaknesses. They have needs in order to make them better frameworks that empower the people and the people's struggles to have real impacts. Many people here participated in Moral Monday, but we have not come together as an EJ movement to define how we should be participating, how our movement, as a movement, and not just as many different organizations participate, but how does our movement influence its direction? How does it strengthen its direction? How does it help it to understand the power that must be built, not only in fighting for around the issues of environmental justice, but fighting around the issues of social justice? We haven't had this discussion. And unfortunately, the Moral Monday, I call it a campaign. Many call it a movement. I think there's still a lot more to do before it becomes a solid movement. It's an important campaign as a phase of an emerging movement. And this is not to just, preoccupy ourselves with just trying to make a point of the difference. But sometimes, when we join an effort, we feel that it now totally defines, the tactics that must be used, the targets that must be identified by the struggle. So we sometimes join, without bringing to these struggles some demands, some needs, that both empowers it and enables us to more empower ourselves. I see a lot of people here who in some way identify with the Moral Monday. What is your power? how can your power be exercised as students in these institutions that either align with the forces and the system, of oppression? How do you impact those institutions? How do you exercise your power? There are workers here who work in many of these institutions. How do we exercise our power? Is it organized? These are questions that we must answer and look for when we think about power. When we think about a movement, we also must think about how that movement defines its power. Are we fighting for some regulatory power? Are we fighting for contending power? Are we fighting for transformative power? Are we fighting for the power of governments? And how do they relate to each other? And again, too often, we're not defining, what kind of power we're trying to build, what kind of relationship our power needs to have to the institutions in the system that causes the suffering of our people and our communities. If we think that we can build a movement or even be in a movement without having some understanding of these questions, then we are in simply a protest movement. And protest is a tactic, it's not a program. Important tactic, but it's not a program. We must have an understanding of what kind of power we are trying to build, and also how strong and the context of the power of the forces that our power needs to challenge. The More Money movement has many similarities to the 1950s and the 60s civil rights movement. Many similarities. But it exists in a different historical period. A period where the role of government and the relationship between government and the economic forces are much different, much concentrated, and very global. If we don't have this understanding or try to develop this understanding as we struggle in our various communities, are we struggling against the same the corporations, that are responsible for the conditions in all of our communities? And if so, how are we uniting our power to challenge these corporations collectively? We have to understand the forces that we're up against. Duke, when people talk about Duke Energy, it's a global corporation. Are we thinking about global alliances and these kinds of things as a way of increasing our power? Too often, the struggle for public policies alone don't think of these questions. And so I raise these things because we have to see the significance of More Money and also the needs of the More Money movement. The 1950s and 60s was a movement that was struggling against a feature of a larger system, a larger economic and political system, a capitalist system, that sought to have a concentrated oppression and exploitation of black people in the South and in the country, a very concentrated oppression. Now, this concentrated oppression was essential for this system to rapidly accumulate, wealth and power while at the same time create conditions that divided the majority of the people that it in some way was creating wealth from. We have to recognize that. When we talk about, sometimes mass movements say, well, we don't want to talk about these sharp issues because somehow it may diffuse or disperse,
Or divide us.
the mass movement. But we need a mass movement to understand what divides us and to commit itself to struggle against these sense of entitlements that this divisive system has created among us all. Race, gender, class, and so-called citizenship and entitlements. The leadership of this movement must be anchored and centered around the most oppressed of the society, so that the starting point of the unity of us all goes to the deepest conditions, the deepest suffering, that affects the people. As a trade unionist, for example, I've seen us fight in the workplace around issues, and then our campaigns, they kind of fizzle out because we've made some economic gains. But in terms of the equality of all workers, even in those economic gains, they were not met and resolved, and so the struggle kind of fizzles out. We have to try to build a movement that don't fizzle out this easy. Moral Monday brings a lot of us together. The EJ movement, we're not just fighting for policies. Our people are dying from these conditions every day. And while public policy is an aspect of the struggle, we have to build the power of our movement to challenge these daily causes of our death, to at least disrupt its ability to so easily kill our people. When we say that CAFOs is devaluing our community, that they're causing all kinds of health problems among our children, and that they're causing us to die sooner than we should, I guess. I don't know what If we're saying that it is a matter of life and death, then we must be prepared to take some risk to save our lives. Some risk to directly challenge those conditions and those institutions to save our lives. If our struggle is solely around trying to convince the policymakers that they should do something, and we wait for the political maneuvers and the agreements and the bureaucracy of the process to find a way, then that time, is time that's continuously killing our people and our communities. And what it does is it misshapes and directs opportunities for people to really understand the potential power that we have to challenge and to transform this system. Moral Monday, being an arrestee of almost 1,000, the demand to drop the charges against arrestees that demonstrated the high expression in this movement of a willingness to take risks to challenge the forces of injustice. And when this element, which has an opportunity to bind us who took these kind of risks closer together, is not understood as an act of courage and an act of need in the masses of our people of what a movement requires. And if people get arrested and you hear nothing about it, and you only rely on the lawyers to do something about it, then we're not using this opportunity to show that people are prepared to take risks to make changes for this system. This is a part of the ideological and the cultural shaping of the courage of a mass movement. But when you relegate this expression of exercising power to a strategy that focuses almost solely on trying to convince even legislators who are dominated by the corporations, to make change as if that's the core of power, the sense of power, then what it does is it holds back the possibility of this movement growing and developing its power. And what it also does is it may prevent us in Rogers Roads, in Baden, in these counties, from feeling that we need to take risks to confront these doggone institutions and criminals and killers in our community. And that what we should do is wait just to try to get some elected official to do it. I asked the question yesterday, if the people sit in front of these KFO operations and stop the trucks from coming in, what are you going to do now as an elected official in there? What is going to be your position? What are you going to do? How do you build on the power exercised by the people in these positions where you're shaping public policy? And so we have to see the importance of this movement, which I didn't speak about, but just believe it is a very, very, just believe it is a very, very important movement. It has at least been able to produce a unified voice in saying that enough is enough is enough. That's very, very, very important, especially when the people are always encouraged to divide and to separate from each other. So this is very important. But what opportunities do we use when we're able to bring people together to make that unity stronger and to increase the power that's possible within this unity? If we are not thinking about that, then I think our assessment of Moral Mondays and of any mass movement could be wrong, no matter what the intent, of the participants and the leaders, etc. Mass movements don't arrive at all of the answers immediately. And sometimes it's trial and error and these kind of things. But that movement must assess and engage the people in assessing, what was the result of our efforts? How can we make them stronger? If this is not a part of a mass movement where people are able to really understand their strengths, learn who their enemy is, learn what the real weaknesses of the enemy is, and then forge a unity to fight, to attack those weaknesses, and to recognize that we're in a system that all who exploit people are also fighting against each other? How do we even exploit the differences that exist among these corporations, and these global governments that are all fighting for some sense of domination? How do we look at that? How do we understand that? Does it make a difference in our analysis? In the EJ movement, you have a real possibility. You are in some of the most oppressed communities. You are speaking about dire conditions, life and death conditions, and you are able to bring to the More Monday movement, not individual, but a more united expression, a more united program, and a better capability to help to push it forward and make it the movement to have the power that we need to have in order to make change. That power is simply in numbers. But we don't think about how those numbers are organized. And see, this is extremely narrow, because the organizing has to start at the bottom. It's not just having faces, who might look like they are from the bottom in leadership positions. The people got to be organized, and the people have to understand, how, they can make challenges, not just one type of challenge, but a number of types of challenges. When we narrow down people's understanding of how to challenge power to just one area, then we're very, very weak in terms of the strategy and the program. So even the question of voting and those kinds of things, when a government and corporation violates its own constitution, what makes us think that a public policy, changes power? I mean, it doesn't change power. Power has to force accountability to public policies. Has to force it. And in fact, power shapes public policies. During the 50s and 60s, the young students said, we're not just going to protest, the issue of public commentation. We're going right in war, if you understand. Damn it, we're going to begin a movement to challenge power that spreads all around. We can stand out, you understand. So we can elect somebody, you understand, to deal with that. You understand? But the people who are being elected are not driven by the people's exercising of the power. And we have to, at some point, come to that realization. The Vietnamese, they understood that they had less, formal weapons, so they engaged in guerrilla warfare. So I'm just saying, you understand, that people have to find a way, you understand, to challenge the power. And you might not be able to do it as a standing army, you understand, but you might be able, you understand, to weaken, attack, you understand, certain parts of the power of the system, you understand, that disrupts it, that prevents it from just moving, at its own will, at its own pace, and these kind of things. And we have to figure out how we mobilize power against power. Not just against the servants of power, but against the actual power. We have to mobilize that. That doesn't exclude all of the rest of the activities, etc. But there's got to be a significant percentage of those great numbers that we speak about, who are organized to be able to directly impact on the institutions that's causing the problem. And brothers and sisters, comrades, if we're really talking about that we have faith and confidence in the most oppressed, they must not be left unorganized. They must not just be, numbers. We're not victims alone. When Hurricane Katrina came, we said that we will say Hurricane Katrina survivors, not just victims. You understand? Whose approach, you understand, is to show just how victimized we are, and to hope, you understand, that our appeal to somebody's moral consciousness about our victimization is somehow going to make them do the right thing. No, we're survivors trying to figure out, you understand, how to exercise power not to be victims, how to transform that. I ain't got no immediate answers. No, I don't have any immediate answers, you understand? But if we don't have a direction that guides us to try to figure out some answers to these questions, then we're just going to be wading in the water. Wading in the water. But that song, wading in the water, was because the enslaved was saying, you trying to break away from the plantation, the dogs is coming, wading in the water. It had a purpose that was tied, to a strategy and to a fight. It didn't just, lull us into something of this nature. And so, yes, you understand, we got to get together to talk about that. Here, how does this summit help, to create mechanisms that tie us together more closely, that begins to train a new kind of leadership about power building, about struggle? This is what a part of what a summit needs to do. How does this summit enable us to get a better understanding of how we go into a broader mass movement? How do we act together? Because let me say this. Many people conditioned by this society, are intimidated by somebody or some group who the media will shape, you understand, as having all of the answers and all of the power. Is intimidated about dissent, is intimidated about saying, well, look, you understand, what about this? We need this. When you don't have that will, you understand, to bring from our communities, our experience, our suffering, this kind of dissent, this kind of insistence on having voice in a struggle. And when I say insistence, I'm not talking about just fighting against somebody. But we got to go, we got to ourselves work our stuff out ourselves and go in. How are we going into this movement? All of us are part of it in some kind of way, but how are we united in this movement so that it's not an afterthought, as you said? You understand? Because see, poor people, you understand, and the black and people of color poor, are too often, even by black people, you understand, who see themselves as not as victimized, you understand, as the most oppressed, black people, sometimes have a very paternalistic, kind of view or relationship, you understand, even with the most oppressed. And so how do we strengthen the voices of the EJ movement, rooted in its most oppressed communities, to bring this into more money? I mean, that's if we can achieve this and then assess this ourselves, then we may have a sense, you understand, of what kind of power we have to be able to influence More Monday. The More Monday's 14-point program, in essence, in the past, talked about hiring some people for some green jobs. This was because it did not, you understand, the program did not come out of a summit, you understand, of people in the base communities. So you just have all kinds of this and stuff and say we got inclusion. That doesn't mean inclusion. It's intended to be inclusion. I'm not talking about intentions, but I'm saying, you understand, what is the role of the summit in forging, an EJ movement, that can have some meaning in shaping, further shaping More Monday, its power, you know, in the movement for social justice. So I think we have to figure that out.
Well, we can always count on Saladin to give us our marching orders. An assessment, and then marching orders. To give you a feel of what it's been like to be part of the Forward Together, Not One Step Back movement, I've asked David Caldwell at the last minute to step in and as not only the, I want to get this right now, project director and community organizer for Rogers Eubanks Neighborhood Association, RENA, but also as a member of the NACP chapter in Carborough. You have a title there?
I'm the head of the Environmental Committee.
On the Bylaws Committee?
Environmental Committee.
Environmental Committee, of course. And an active participant, and I've seen him many times on occasions on Mondays in Raleigh when we were at the Forward Together, Not One Step Back. So I'm going to ask him to talk to that, and then we'll move to Fred Tubman.
Thank you. Even though it's a short notice, it's always a pleasure to be up here. Those who know my boss, Minister Campbell, we travel around and speak all up and down the East Coast. And he's one that you really don't want to go behind because he's so dynamic. Omega Wilson's another one that I don't like going behind because he has his stuff together. And now I have to add Mr. Muhammad to that list. So, he really has his stuff together. For us and RENA, at the Moral Mondays, we always looked at it in our area as the patches to equipped. And each patch is not going to keep you warm, but as you start to sew those patches together, it gets stronger, you get warmer, you feel more secure. And as he was saying, you get the power. And if you can take power from a person, you can control them. And that is what they're doing. And Moral Mondays are giving us that power back. And we'll continue to do it. And when we go in as individuals, you know, we're like they said, just, you know, we're the fingers on a hand. But when we get together and they across the country, not just North Carolina, but across the country, they see us coming together as a fist, and that's power. And that's one of the things the Moral Monday has done for RENA and the area. And not just us, but you know, look at all the other our farm workers, the CAFOs, all the other people that are having problems, who have been fighting for years and going in front of organizations, but only as a small group.
Those of us who were fortunate enough to be here last year and listen to our Saturday keynote speaker will be glad to know that Mr. Fred Tubman, a riverkeeper of the Pawtuxet River, did I say that right?
Pretty close, good Algonquin.
Which is in Maryland,
Yes.
basically. He explained to us last year how being, advocating for a overwhelmingly African-American community that's settled along the river, they have been the ones to most incur the devastation that comes from corporate polluting and destroying the environment, and then the complicity of the government, and sometimes the half-stepping of traditional environmental organizations. That is what he spoke so eloquently about last year, and I'm sure his contribution this year will add to that. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll be brief. I have learned a lot from the Moral Mondays. Not because I'm certainly a Marylander and have attended at least one, maybe two Moral Mondays, but I've been following this movement with avid interest because it has really helped me clarify in my own mind the distinction between grassroots work and work that is driven by top-down, moneyed, heavily funded interests, who granted, in many instances, do really important environmental work, these larger top-down causes. But it's not fundamentally the same work that is being done by people who are coming from a local source of power, who are plain folks, who are not on anybody's payroll, who are not answerable to someone's funding interest. In some respects, it creates a sense of schizophrenia, because I think we, on one hand, operate in an environment where EJ is an afterthought within the mainstream movement, right? It's not seen as something that's integrated with broader interests like global warming and saving, various animal species and things like that. And it's too bad, because I think EJ clearly has a much better story to tell across the board. It's a story that is compassionate, almost always. It is a story about inclusion. It is a story that is spiritually grounded to place and to one another. I have a friend whom I miss greatly, who's passed away, who showed me quite a lot about the EJ movement. Joe, my good friend Joe, he used to tell me, keep it real. And to me, the Moral Monday movement is entirely about keeping it real. It's grounded in where some of the worst problems are in our society. And Joe used to tell me that if you really wanted to get something done about the condition of this planet, you would start exactly where the worst problems are. Because thereafter, right, those places that are not so bad off will kind of fall into line behind your efforts, right? That if you start where the worst problems are, everything else kind of sorts itself out. And that's huge as far as, I think, a set of values about where our priorities are. So the schizophrenia is real, I think, because on one hand, we have moneyed organizations who want to do good environmental work, who also simultaneously want to placate sources of power and money, or at least don't want to go there. And so they have kind of I think, a blind spot to EJ concerns because they don't think they're fundamentally ecosystem concerns. And so they leave those problems to someone else. And people often say to me in my realm where I work, we're not sociologists, we're not social workers, we're not this, we're not that, we're not economists, we're just environmentalists. As though somehow you can separate out, that you can partition sociology and economics and all of those things from issues of fundamental environmental fairness. And I think that benefits folks who are, of course, funded by or beholden to moneyed interests, who just want the planet cleaned up in some instances, but don't want to disturb the underlying power relationships. We'll leave that other stuff alone. So what has appalled me is that while we have a better story to tell, rather than be inspired to tell that story with us, sometimes it really creates resentment. People resent that we have a better story to tell. How dare you have a better story to tell? So there is this rift, I think, that exists, and it's terrible, and it's sad, and it's tragic, because we should be one movement, in my view. These are all the same problems, all the same root causes, and yet we operate as a footnote in the rest of the environmental movement. Oh yeah, now we're going to do some EJ stuff, but then we're going to get back to the real business of saving the planet. So it troubles me, and the Moral Monday movement, because of its incredible power that it has amassed, and its incredible inclusiveness. I mean, goodness gracious, what a broad-based movement of people who are coming from many, many different walks. And we certainly have gotten some attention, and I think we've been riveting, and I think the poetry of what we have to say is both beautiful, and Salaman is saying, we have to mold that into something that is enduring and lasting. And I think the key to that is built within the power of dissent. You have to exercise dissent in order to get anything done. Right? I believe that positive thinking movements, we're always saving something, and we're partnering with someone, we're collaborating, Something the other day was talking about how they're collaborating with Walmart, It makes that kind of an oxymoron. It sounds very compelling because it's so positive. And then people tell me, well, you're working on all this EJ stuff and all this neighborhood stuff and this community stuff, and it sounds so negative, so dark. I mean, snap out of it. Why don't you do some upbeat stuff? Because upbeat raises money. Upbeat makes people feel good. But worse, it actually chills the willingness to change anything. Right? Upbeat also makes people really complacent, and they just want to write checks without actually investing themselves in people and communities. Where I work in the Bay movement, we're all about saving crabs and oysters. People in communities, somebody else is working on that. It's shocking when you really look at it in black and white. Like, really? That's what this movement is about? It's not intentional. It's just how I think some folks have been indoctrinated. They need help from us to ground their work and to keep it real. So in sum, I would say what I have learned more acutely than anywhere else I've ever seen in my meager years on this planet is that the EJ movement and the Moral Mondays movement puts a face on these problems. It keeps it real by keeping it connected to something that's genuine. And it exercises real power as opposed to illusory kind of, plastic power that's kind of malleable to authority. And that's why it's, I think, dangerous to some interest too, because, if you're a top-down interest, if you're a top-down foundation, you can't control a grassroots movement. That's its power. It is uncontrollable to any centralized source of power. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. So that's my lesson learned.